Hello and welcome to this episode of our program Daily Debate. As usual, we are discussing a very contentious debate. Today we'll be discussing the headline of the day, which is the climate change. This important and significant summit that is taking place in Paris. Of course, it is discussing a global threat, which is the climate change. Climate change is a challenge that cannot be overcome by one country alone, but rather by all countries together. If we're speaking about climate change, then we are speaking about a phenomenon, or rather an issue that has no passports. It has already several repercussions, and its repercussions are very much felt by people all over the world. This is what we are speaking about today, the climate challenge or the climate change challenge, and of course the threat of it to the life and livelihood of the whole globe at large. The challenge now, or this is what they are facing in this summit in Paris, is to move much further and faster to reduce global emissions, and also to reduce the global emissions so we can keep the global temperature rise below the 2 degrees Celsius, while at the same time support countries to adapt to the inevitable consequences. This is exactly what we are going to speak about, this threat. How is it affecting our societies? When President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi addressed this summit today, he spoke about a challenge that is equal to other challenges, of course equal to terrorism, and partial from the sustainable development the world has ratified in New York a few months ago. Before we start with our discussion, let us first see this report, the climate change, and of course this important and significant meeting in Paris, and we'll come back for discussion.
World leaders converged on Paris on Monday for international climate talks aimed at an unprecedented security lockdown 2 weeks after gunmen and suicide bombers killed 130 people in a string of terror attacks. Heads of state and government from some 150 countries will speak in turn at a highly secure airport complex north of the city over the next 2 weeks in an effort to reach a global agreement on limiting emissions. To get a deal by mid-December, negotiators must overcome differences between rich and poor economies, high polluters, and countries already suffering from rising temperatures. French President François Hollande said that what is at stake is the future of the planet, the future of life. One emerging sore spot in the talks is that the level of funding that richer countries will provide both the aid, the transition of poorer countries to cleaner energy, and to finance efforts to stave off the early effects of a changing climate. Developing countries warn their highly industrialized peers that have used large amounts of fossil fuels for a century to mobilize $100 billion a year in climate financing. And some officials have warned that won't support a deal in Paris that doesn't deliver high levels of funding. Any agreement would require the consent of nearly 200 countries. Shortly ahead of the talks, India slammed an October estimate on how much financing rich countries have provided to poorer economies. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development set out guidelines in the report to measure whether rich nations are on track to deliver $100 billion in promised annual financing by 2020. India said that Paris-based think tank overestimated that amount of actual flows when it said it reached $61.8 billion in 2014. The OECD shot back, saying the report was a genuine attempt to provide a transparent estimate that avoided double counting based on official submissions by rich countries. As part of the rich countries' attempts to soothe tensions over financing, U.S. President Barack Obama and Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates unveiled the multi-billion-dollar program Monday to boost green energy research and development. The 20 countries that have signed on to mission innovation include leading carbon dioxide emitters from developed and developing countries, including China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia and France. They are pledging to double their investment in clean energy research and development during the next 5 years. Protests were held by climate activists calling for countries to do more to curb emissions and keep climate change at bay. But that didn't stop unofficial gatherings. On Sunday, riot police fired tear gas as they clashed with demonstrators who refused to disperse from Place de la République, northeast of central Paris. Candles and flowers from a memorial to the victims of Paris attacks were scattered in the confrontation. Police said 174 demonstrators were detained before the Paris talks began. Most of the countries involved submitted their own plans for curbing emissions of greenhouse gases linked to climate change or boosting the share of green energy. Anna Kirklinch in Paris, who codified those national plans, part of an original goal to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius above the levels. The current pledges are only likely to limit global warming to about 2.7 degrees, so the US, Europe and other countries want the Paris Accord to require countries to renew their emissions targets every 5 years, also helping shift the world toward the 2-degree goal over time. The goal is wrapping up an agreement at the ministerial level by the end of next week.
Right, welcome back. And before we proceed on with our discussion, let me first welcome our guests, Dr. Mohammed Bayoumi, Director of the Environment Department at the UNDP, an expert in climate change. We thank you very much for joining us. Okay. And Mr. Salah Hafez, former Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency. Thank you very much for joining us. And let me have the general question at first so we can understand exactly what we're speaking about. The significance of this year's summit. Why is it significant?
This year,
yes,
this year, the summit this year is coming with something new that we haven't seen beforehand. That there's going to be some commitments on developing and developed countries alike to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Beforehand, all the negotiations and the discussions were trying to get commitments on the developed countries, because historically the problem started actually with the industrialized countries, that they were the ones who were producing the high portion of greenhouse gas, which caused the phenomena that we are suffering from right now. Today, the developing countries actually are producing greenhouse gases more than the developed countries, and the world have reached the stage that it has to be a joint activity between developed and developing countries, that they have to reduce emissions. Obviously, they are not supposed to reduce emissions by the same amount. Developed countries.
You started to go into details of the core of the problem, but I just wanted to understand why this year is very much significant than any other of the past meetings.
Because there's a new agreement that's going to be signed, hopefully. There is still negotiations around this agreement, the Paris package, which will put commitments on both developed and developing countries. That's why it's something new. The other new thing that has been known, that meeting the target of the 2 degrees Celsius, probably the world is not going to be able to meet it. And now, most likely, the temperature by the end of this century is going to be more than the 2 degrees Celsius. So this put more pressure on developed and developing countries actually to act together in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes. And to understand exactly what Dr. Bayoumi here is speaking about, let us just have an idea about what is this phenomenon, what is the climate change, so people can really understand what threat and what phenomena we're speaking about.
Okay, I'll talk about the phenomenon, and also I'd like to make comment on the first question about the importance, why this is significant. It's not really, it's a watershed period now in the combating of climate change, because the agreement was signed in 1992 at the Earth Summit. It was attended by leaders of many countries, and then went through different phases and different studies until today they decided that they have to include the developing countries, because their emissions became more than the emissions of the original industrial companies that created the problem. But this phenomenon is, the planet Earth is surrounded by a number of greenhouse gases in the 3 kilometers surrounding the Earth, the planet Earth, and this creates capturing of heat, because the heat comes from the sun, falls at the surface of Earth, absorbed by Earth, and then when the sun sets, it goes back again, the hot air goes back again to the space. But because of the greenhouse gases, it's captured and reflected and refracted within this layer, so it generates heat that enable human beings and creatures to live on this planet. Otherwise, it'll be very hot in the daytime and extremely cold in the night time. So this is the phenomenon that we're talking about. But after the Industrial Revolution and fossil fuel, everyone was proud of developing and developing the industry and creating, not knowing the danger of creating carbon dioxide in particular, because other gases are some other gases are more effective in capturing the heat, but carbon dioxide, because of the amount, the volume, it is responsible for about 65 or 70% of the reason for the rising temperature. So when it was discovered, they realized that the rate of increase in the temperature is faster than people and human beings and creatures can adapt to the change, because the whole system is changing in a very short period of time. Historically, in the history of geology or planet Earth, there were many changes in temperatures.
Yes.
But over a longer period of time, then the adaptation was possible. So they decided to cut down in Kyoto in 1997.
Yes, we'll go to that. We'll go to that.
This is the phenomenon.
Yes, exactly. This is the phenomenon. If we go to the challenge now, yes, indeed, they during the or earlier there was this Kyoto Protocol. But if we speak about, before going to the Kyoto Protocol and what is needed more than this agreement, let me ask about the challenge now. Now, what they are speaking about now is to further and faster reduce the global carbon emissions. How is this, or how can this be done in the first place?
If you allow me to start by referring to the Sustainable Development Goals that the world leaders has approved last September in the UN. And one indicator related to the Sustainable Development Goals was about energy, having 3 indicators. The first indicator was about universal access to energy by 2030 to everybody on the earth. And unfortunately, this is not going to be possible by the fossil fuel. We don't have resources that's sufficient for everybody to get the energy and enjoy it, like having the carbon footprint like a US citizen, for instance. We need like 9 planets of Earth, to satisfy these needs. So in order to achieve this universal access to energy, there were 2 other indicators actually in this specific goal. One about doubling the renewable energy production, and another one on the doubling the energy efficiency. These are the 2 elements of mitigation that are very important to reduce the greenhouse gas, which the governments, the different governments and different states are putting their targets, how much renewable energy I'm going to produce or generate over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and how much energy efficiency I will be able to do. Energy efficiency is the fastest mechanism to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, having the same functions that I'm doing right now, but with less energy. And renewable energy, obviously, I'm depending on another source of energy rather than the fossil fuel, going to renewable sources like hydro, solar, wind energy. These are the 2 mechanisms that the states have to adopt in order to reduce these emissions and, in the same time, fulfill their development objectives and go for development as well.
But what you're speaking about, sir, and these renewable energy resources that you've been speaking about, sir, while we spoke to some of the experts, they spoke about the ability of all countries to obtain such energies, that is because of their high costs. So what are we speaking about here? I mean, is before, of course, going to this track through new renewable resources, can we really reduce the carbon emissions through the resources, the existing resources in the meanwhile?
Rationalization of usage of energy, the efficiency of energy is the main thing to reduce the carbon dioxide emission, because the carbon dioxide is emitted from the fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is the coal and petroleum products, including gas. Gas also produces carbon dioxide, but in less quantities. So the idea now is to make the combustion more efficient and effective to produce less carbon dioxide. But it will inevitably, carbon dioxide will be produced as long as you're using fossil fuel. So the first thing, what to do with the emissions, carbon dioxide? Can you pump it back in the earth and use it for any industry, like they call it sequestration, to sequestrate the carbon dioxide and put it back in? But to leave it free in the atmosphere, it will create capturing of the heat. The other thing is to convert from fossil fuel to renewables. Well, 99-point-something% of the energy used originally comes from the sun, including the fossil fuel, because it turned into carbon because of the photosynthesis of the algae and so on. So, sun, we've got enough sun. For instance, in North Africa, the 3% of the sun falls in North Africa is enough to provide Europe with all the energy needed in Europe. But the problem, as you said, the cost and the technology. So they are moving. There are two ways. There are many ways. No need to get into the technical details, but the bottleneck is the technology is not cost effective enough. Even Germany, they once produced about 56% of the electricity from solar energy through photovoltaic. Now they're farming out all the facilities to other countries to use feed-in tariff. So the technology is still in the early stage, although development, especially the material that used is developing very rapidly. But the bottleneck is the cost for the renewable energy.
And do we have the luxury of time?
No, not really, not anymore. Because I was going to say, in Kyoto, they set targets to 2012. Now they're setting a target to the end of the century. 2 degrees Celsius above the temperature that prevailed during the Industrial Revolution, before the Industrial Revolution, for the energy to stabilize and for the whole world can adapt to the changes, because 2 degrees is too much. In thousands of years, a few degrees rise in the past. But now, in 100 or 150 years, we're talking about 2 degrees, which is creating a lot of everything, all negative impacts, like sea level rise and change of crop droughts and hurricanes and disease and water scarcity and things like that.
Yes, and that is, of course, another issue that we are going to discuss, the repercussions of such a phenomenon and how to cope with them, or how the world can help, particularly the developing countries. If you
allow me to follow up on what Dr. Salah have mentioned actually about the price of renewable energy. It is well known that the investment in the research and development in renewable energy is always attached to the prices of the fossil fuel. When the prices go high, there is much of the development and research and development in this business that get the price less. Today, we can say that the price of generation of electricity from wind is quite competitive to the generation of electricity from fossil fuel. In countries where they are selling the fossil fuel at the actual price, the opportunity cost. Obviously, these prices cannot compete with subsidized fuel. Solar energy cost has dropped by like 60%, 70% over the last 5 years after Europe has embarked on the feed-in tariff program. So once I'm doing some incentives for users to use renewable energy, I'm pushing the R&D, I'm pushing the commercialization of these technologies, the prices goes down. Once I start to lean more on fossil fuel and I find it a cheap resource, then the renewable energy costs will remain expensive, and it's going to be much competitive with it cannot compete with the fossil fuel.
So we can go through through both tracks. Yes. Right. So let me get back to this Kyoto Protocol. And I mean here analysts, particularly those concerned with the environment, said that the best known milestone to come out of the previous climate change summits was the adaptation or the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, which is a non-binding agreement by 192 states to lower greenhouse gas emission to 5% below in 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. So we're speaking about more than 25 years ago. What happened since then?
Kyoto Protocol actually was targeting mainly the industrial countries, and the target, as you have mentioned, was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5.2%. And this was very modest target actually, because the target now that the developed countries should achieve is something like 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Kyoto Protocol, I would call it, was a rehearsal for what we're trying to approach right now. And it was quite successful rehearsal, but the real work is starting right now. 80% reduction in about 30 years from the greenhouse gas emissions is really very ambitious target.
But did we really get to this 5% below which they were speaking about?
Yes, the most of the developed countries were able to achieve this target. Some of them did not achieve it. But as I said, I mean, this was not the significant reduction that the world is waiting for. The business starts now, and it's not going to be only for, as I mentioned at the beginning, not only developed countries. Developing countries has to participate as well. And normally the developing countries are more focused on adaptation rather than mitigation. But with the development that's taking place in the development pace that's taking place in many developing countries, renewable energy and energy efficiency, which are the main mitigation measures, became necessary actually for them. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, we are not going to be able to secure all these development activities with the fossil fuel. Simply, there is no fossil fuel that's sufficient for the whole population on the earth to use and enjoy their life. I mean, the way developed countries are enjoying it right now.
Very much indeed. Right. Now, what the whole world are negotiating now is a deal that they will come out with. And this deal should be clear, comprehensive, binding to all countries. Negotiators here must overcome the differences between the rich countries and the poor countries. So we're speaking about high polluter countries and less polluter ones. And the high polluter countries have their own problems, while the less polluter countries are suffering from rising temperatures. So there is this problem that we have to have this balance between them. Tell me more about this problem and how it can really hinder any progress in negotiations or a deal.
There were many preparatory meetings before the COP, the meeting which is on now, by asking countries to present the program in total to reduce 80% of the greenhouse gases and make sure that it stabilizes before 1950 for the temperature to rise 2 degrees Celsius above the industrial As I understand, you know, I was in a meeting in Athens the other day, about 76% presented their program, including China. China, by the way, at the time the climate change convention was signed, their share of the carbon dioxide was 4%. Now they're 25%. And China and India was 1.5%, now they're 10%. So they refuse to become a party to the agreement because it will hinder their development if they have to cut down the usage of energy. But anyway, the remaining amount of greenhouse carbon dioxide cuts, the countries, including Egypt, we did not present any program because we don't have the money to do it. We don't have the resources, so we cannot commit without making sure that the money is available. So this is exactly what's happening now in Paris. They're negotiating only how to get enough resources for the remaining 25% or whatever, the countries to put commitment, make sure that resources are available. So this is the challenge and the fight which is going on in Paris now.
What kind of commitments are we speaking about here? And I mean from both sides, the developed and the developing countries. What kind of commitments that are very much essential and needed in this agreement, so we can say that...
carbon dioxide emission?
Definitely there is
Yes.
different scenarios for the cuts of greenhouse gas emissions. The UNDP has presented a model actually in 2007 showing that developed countries has to cut down their emissions by 2050 by 80% of their production in 1990. The model allowed the given allowance for the developing countries to continue using fossil fuel and increase their greenhouse gas emissions until 2020 and to reach the peak and starts to reduce again the consumption in order to reach a figure of like 20% reduction from their levels in 1990. And this was the model that the UNDP have shown for the world to avoid the 2 degrees Celsius and the carbon dioxide concentration not to reach the 550 threshold, 550 part per million threshold that would lead to this 2 degrees Celsius. Maybe, as Dr. Salah has mentioned, that Egypt did not present commitments in the Paris COP, but Egypt is doing actually activities. Egypt has a target now for solar energy production of 2,000 megawatts and another 2,000 megawatts for wind energy. And these are the type of commitments that the world would like to hear. Egypt now has a program for converting lighting systems to efficient lighting system, LED, and the Ministry of Electricity is distributing more than 10 million LED lamps. This is the type of activities, measures, energy efficiency measures, and renewable energy measures that would lead to the reduction of greenhouse gas. It doesn't mean, this is extremely important, I have to emphasize this, it doesn't mean that Egypt will be able to cut down its greenhouse gas emissions. But Egypt would be able to curtail or lower the rate of increase. And instead of increasing, say, to give an example of 10% a year, I can increase by 4 or 3%. And reduce this amount of 7% by renewable energy and energy efficiency. But for sure, developing countries during this period, including Egypt in particular, will have to increase the emissions maybe over the next 10 or 20 years.
Since you brought the issue of, or since you brought Egypt in this discussion, then let us first watch the report and the President Sisi addressing and giving the African initiative during the climate change summit in Paris. Let's watch the report. What exactly did Egypt bring up? What were the African initiatives? Let's watch the report and come back for discussion.
President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi addressed the Climate Change Summit, which is held in Paris, Sisi has started his speech by offering condolences to the French leadership and people for the victims of the Paris terrorism incident in which 130 people were killed, and reiterated Egypt's condemnation to the brutal incident, calling for an international unity in combating terrorism and fulfill the aspiration of our nations. He said that few months ago, an international ambitions plan for sustainable development and eradicating poverty has been ratified in New York, stressing that plan will not be completed without achieving a clear, comprehensive and fair international agreement to confront climate change challenges. He said Africa demands an international, just and clear agreement that considers the disparity of burdens between developed and developing countries. Sisi said Egypt and the African countries have already accomplished the required contribution in the climate change file, adding that capabilities of the developing countries should be boosted to be able to endure the challenges of climate change consequences. He said that Africa, compared to developed nations, are less responsible for emissions of greenhouse gases that cause climate change. Sisi also called for larger funding and technical support to the African nations to combat the effects of climate change. Sisi told the global leaders gathering Monday for a United Nations Climate Summit in Paris that all African nations are contributing less to the total harmful emissions and are the most affected by climate change. He called for bolstering the ability of developing countries to cope with climate change while urging a funding of $100 million yearly by 2020 to developing countries to fend off the phenomena. Sisi, who heads a UN Climate Change Committee of African leaders, cited a UN environmental report putting the financial gap in funding to African $12 million a year by 2020, a gap that expected to widen. Egypt is the current head of the African Union Climate Change Committee and as such will represent African countries' interests in the Paris
development.
Right, welcome back. And the report and what President Sisi has said during his speech before of course, the more than 190 something countries from the whole world attending and presenting African initiatives. Two African initiatives. One was to use the renewables, and the other was to how to sustain the consequences of the phenomena of the climate change and how the world can really support or aid Africa to do this. Yes.
The problem of Africa, President El-Sisi is representing Africa, and the problem in Africa that they cannot develop the policies and can implement any commitments because the systems, institutions are not available, and they're suffering from, Egypt is suffering from all negative impacts of the global warming. Sea level rise, the scarcity of water, desertification, the disease.
And President Sisi was very much alarmed and aware of this when he spoke and said that Egypt has started to be committed much more towards this phenomenon. But yes, please
but Africa is suffering right, left, and center. And they're poor countries. They don't have resources. They don't have the know-how. They don't have R&D. They don't have institutions that can follow up. The problem is the developed countries, the network is there to implement any system that is put forward. Whereas in the developing countries, this is the main problem. And most importantly, the consumption pattern and the style of life. We have to, like, it's known that the middle class, they're creating problems for the environment much more than the poor people because of the style of life and so on, and the luxury. This is for the environment at large. But I'm talking about climate change. The harvesting of forests, for instance, is very, very important because forests and water, seas and oceans, they act as a sink for the carbon dioxide. So you emit and then you have to absorb because of the photosynthesis of the green and also the water attracts. There are many other methods that was introduced in a science called the geotechnology, geoengineering rather, to change the characteristics of the water to make it more absorbing more carbon dioxide. But the international community, of course, refused to go through dealing with nature, because invariably, if you do this with the nature, it fights back, as it were. So the problem of Africa, you find all negative impacts occurring, very difficult to get them to follow any policies or to implement commitments, and more importantly, lack of money. So Egypt is representing Africa, and they're trying to sell these handicaps that African countries have in all fronts, on all fronts. So this is a difficult task, and I think we're doing a good job lately, in compiling all the requirements in Africa and the provisions needed for Africa to be presented in this conference.
It's very important to be presented, but very important also to be implemented. Anyway, a binding agreement in Paris that provides clear rules of the road for strengthening the global ambition, of course, in order to reach what we need of this carbon emission, or rather greenhouse emission. Is this reachable?
Yes, I think it is reachable if there is a will. This is, the technology now gives us the opportunities that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But sometimes it comes at a cost. And as you were discussing a short while ago, if I'm not ready to pay this cost right now, other generations are going to pay it.
Do they really think about other generations to come? What are the challenges that may hinder the target of reaching such an ambition?
Obviously, cost comes at the center of all the discussions, and it goes both ways now. The developing countries are trying to get access to technology and cheap renewable energy technologies and energy efficiency technologies on one hand, but meanwhile, the developing countries as well are correctly negotiating the adaptation. The other side of the coin, of the climate change coin, is the adaptation, because there are now some impacts that are affecting these poor countries, the less developed countries, due to the changes in the climate change. So the developing countries are entering into a very tough negotiation process, trying to get money to secure protection from the imminent climate change impacts, as well as trying to get access to technology and capacity building and finance to implement renewable energy and energy efficiency energy efficiency activities. Mind you that today, this year, we heard that the figure of investment in renewable energy has reached the order of $275 billion a year. Investment in renewable energy, which is a big business right now. And if I'm trying to attract that investment, I mean, in a developing country, this could be one of the channels for job creation and investment in the country. And in the meantime, not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but securing energy stability in the country for the developing countries as well.
If what you were speaking about, sir, was a kind of striking a balance between the leadership role of the developed countries and, of course, the increasing of responsibility of the developing countries. If we're speaking about that, and that was part of a solution, how can this balance be struck really?
There's another factor very important. The instability in this area is also hindering the communication and developing capacity building and so on. So this is another issue, terrorism and instability, political instability and military instability in the area also will be discussed in this summit, by the way. But the leaders the leadership is there, but it's not trickling down to the really poor people and communities very well. The system is not conducive to making this communication to occur. This is the problem I mentioned. Policies, it's very difficult to implement and abide by commitments that are enforced or make the system operable. So this is one thing that the UN is trying very hard to introduce the system, to make it conducive for the leadership will and the leadership enthusiasm to reach all levels of communities.
If I may just comment easily, and I don't know if this is the case here, we feel like we are living in two earths. I mean, an earth for the developed countries and another earth for the developing countries, and maybe the developed countries do not see that they all live in this one earth, that any consequences or any problem that happens in the developing countries will reflect on them and tremendously, or this is how I see matters anyway.
Yeah, this was very well portrayed by Dr. Mohammed. He said if we take by the carbon footprint of the average American and want to develop other countries to have the same carbon footprint, we need 9 planets like Earth to sustain the burden that will be introduced.
And since we don't have the luxury of having 9 Earths.
And they're living there, but this is the reason they delayed the commitment on the developing countries to give them. I remember in one incident they were discussing in a plenary session that they want to impose a commitment on the developing countries. So one African minister was there. He said, well, I'm ready to take any commitment you put, but I need the money to be able to generate carbon dioxide, because to emit carbon dioxide. I don't have enough money to develop my country to emit. Give me the money and I emit and then put...
And this is another question that I'm raising here now. The developed countries must ensure the finance or the funding and the technology to be transferred to the developing countries. Otherwise, are they really aware that this part of Earth can really reflect tremendously on this other side of the world?
I think that the politicians are fully aware. That's why they are gathering every year now in this conference.
Yes,
of party
they are
meetings.
gathering.
The negotiations are quite tough, we have to admit. And each party is trying to get the best out of these negotiations. But I think that the whole world leaders now are aware about the serious impacts of climate change. And they know that we have passed several red lines, I mean, in terms of going into the irreversible impacts on the planet. And we all hope that they will reach a conclusion that it's satisfactory to everybody.
What kind of fund, how much are we speaking about, and what kind of technology do the developing countries need to really transfer to the developing ones?
As I mentioned at the beginning, that developing countries' main focus in the negotiation is mainly on adaptation, actually. And adaptation is receiving, obviously for known reasons, less funds than mitigation. Mitigation is the core problem related to energy generation. Adaptation is receiving like peanuts in comparison to what is being injected now in renewable energy and energy efficiency. The target to reach, as I mentioned, that for renewable energy we have a target today that we have an already existing figure of over $270 billion a year. The ultimate objective for adaptation is to reach the 100 billion a year by 2020. And today the expenditures on adaptation, or the support of the developed countries to do the developing countries in terms of adaptation, is less than 20 billion. There is a newly established Green Climate Fund, has $10 billion in it. So far, the target is to reach this $100 billion a year by 2020. But so far, what's being spent in the area of adaptation is really minimal. Vis-a-vis that there was always a general consensus that adaptation is going we start to have the impacts of climate change by 2050, 2060, when we see the disturbance in the hydrological cycles and the sea level rise starts to flood low-lying lands in many river deltas. But maybe the public is not quite aware about the extreme weather events that we start to face right now, which is the storms, the strong storms that are hitting many places in the world these days. And this is one of the phenomena which are completely associated with climate change. You see cities that are being flooded, and in a way that has never happened beforehand, and each time they are throwing the blame on the infrastructure, which definitely the infrastructure need to be updated and upgraded in order to cope with these new systems. But also there has to be another line of work and activities that has to start right now on the disaster risk reduction and disaster management in order to minimize the casualties until I'm able to fix the infrastructure to cope with the changing climate.
Finally, and I have just a minute and a half here, but if a clear agreement, a real one, a binding one to all parties, to all countries, was not really reached this time, from your point of view, how long can the world survive?
I read a report, if temperature, if business as usual at one point of time continued to the end of the century, and the temperature rise between 4 and 6 degrees by the end of the century, planet Earth will not be inhabitable. To that extent, you will have a holocaust of the biodiversity. You have many changes occur so rapidly for any creature or anyone to adapt. So the risk is there, and we're seeing it every day. And the problem, if we don't reach a categorical agreement in this, I think we're doomed.
I guess with this we end up our episode. This is quite a threat, I guess, to humanity at large. We're not speaking about political differences. We're not speaking about who wants another country's and who is greedy to have this. No, we're speaking about the Earth. We're speaking about all humanity. Dr. Mohammed Bayoumi, Director of the Environment Department at the UNDP and expert in climate change, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Salah Hafez, former chairman of the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency, thank you very much for joining us. And dear viewers, many thanks for watching. Good night.